The world, once adorned by endless oceans, awoke to an earth-shattering silence. The oceans had simply vanished, leaving behind a desolate, lifeless expanse where once there was the pulse of the planet. One moment, the seas lapped at the shores. The next, they were gone, as if swallowed by the very earth that held them. In every corner of the globe, confusion rippled through societies. Nations reeled as they gazed at the empty horizon where vast bodies of water had been, now nothing but dry, cracked earth. The sun blazed down on lands that had once been bathed in the cooling embrace of the sea, and the air felt different, heavier, almost as if the planet itself was gasping for breath. At first, no one could comprehend what had happened. Scientists scrambled for answers, but no logical explanation seemed to fit. Could it have been a cosmic event? Some believed it was a man-made disaster, others a cosmic anomaly, but nothing made sense. Earthquakes, storms, and strange magnetic anomalies surged through the land. Governments went into crisis mode. Emergency meetings were held as food and water began to dwindle. Without the oceans, rainfall patterns became erratic and crops began to wither. Climate chaos erupted. Every day the temperature swung violently between extremes, frost in the mornings, scorching heat by midday, and violent storms at night. It was as if the balance that the oceans had once provided was forever lost. People turned their eyes toward the horizon in a desperate search for answers. But there was no return, no sign of the oceans, no trace. A chilling emptiness replaced what had once been the world's greatest resource. The impact was immediate and devastating. Coastal cities that had flourished now stood in eerie silence. Abandoned buildings once filled with life were now hollowed out, the remains of a civilization that relied on the ocean's resources. Ships that once sailed the seas now sat rusting on dry land. Their crews vanished, leaving only questions behind. What would come next? The oceans had given life, and without them, life itself seemed to be slipping away. People looked to the skies for salvation, yet found only the oppressive sun above. It was then, in the absence of the familiar vastness, that humanity's deepest fears began to emerge. Could the oceans have disappeared forever? Were they lost, or had they been stolen? Their disappearance the beginning of a grander, darker mystery. The loss of the oceans had not only taken the Earth's lifeblood, it had shaken the foundations of the human spirit. A global reckoning had begun. This was no longer just about survival. It was about uncovering the truth of what lay behind the ocean's sudden disappearance and what consequences might follow. With no answers yet, the world stood still in the unyielding grip of an enigma. As the world grappled with the eerie reality of a planet without oceans, the consequences of their sudden disappearance became increasingly impossible to ignore. Within days, the collapse of society's infrastructure began. The oceans had been the cornerstone of global trade, and without them, the world's economies were on the brink of total collapse. Port cities, once bustling with trade and commerce, now stood as ghost towns, their ships stranded, unable to cross the vast stretches of earth that once connected nations by sea. The ripple effect was immediate. Nations that had relied on fishing as a primary food source watched helplessly as their industries disintegrated. Hunger spread rapidly, and famine loomed large on the horizon. Governments scrambled to implement emergency measures, but the damage was already done. Freshwater supplies, which had once been abundant, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. With no oceans to regulate the water cycle, rain became sporadic, and rivers, which had sustained millions, began to dry up. The world's reliance on these natural systems, once taken for granted, had become painfully evident. The climate, once regulated by the ocean's temperature and currents, became erratic. Some regions baked under an unforgiving sun, while others were battered by extreme storms and heavy rainfall. The fragile balance of nature, so delicately sustained by the oceans, was broken. Desperation set in as people turned to whatever resources they could find. Water was rationed, food became a luxury, and the societal structure began to crumble. Nations that had once been united by trade and shared resources now found themselves isolated, their borders closed in a desperate attempt to secure dwindling supplies. But the worst was yet to come. The loss of the oceans wasn't just about missing bodies of water, it was about the very fabric of life itself unraveling. The ecosystems that once thrived in the seas were gone, leaving entire species of animals and plants to perish. The ripple effect of this loss was felt in every corner of the world. Land animals that had once relied on marine life for sustenance found themselves starving, their food chain disrupted beyond repair. Birds that had migrated across oceans now found their paths blocked by vast stretches of dry, barren land. It was as if the world itself had forgotten how to function without the ocean's steady rhythm. Across the planet, human ingenuity began to take over. Desperate scientists worked tirelessly to find new sources of water, but nothing could replace what had been lost. Desalination plants, once an afterthought, became the last hope for many, but they could only provide a fraction of what was needed. Nations turned inward, hoarding resources, while the rest of the world watched in horror as the global community fractured. Communities once thriving on the coastlines were now isolated and left to fend for themselves. The sense of unity that had once defined human civilization was slipping away, replaced by fear, suspicion, and survival instincts. Amidst the growing chaos, people began to whisper of strange occurrences, of magnetic anomalies, strange cosmic alignments, and hints of a deeper, darker force at work. Could the disappearance of the oceans have been a natural disaster, or was there something more sinister at play? The unanswered questions began to gnaw at the collective consciousness of the world, as humanity's darkest fears began to come to the surface. The immediate aftermath of the ocean's disappearance had left the world in turmoil, but the deeper, more terrifying truth of what had occurred was still a mystery, one that no one yet had the answers to. As the world continued to reel from the ocean's disappearance, one truth became abundantly clear. Without water, life could not survive. The seas had not only been the source of nourishment for marine life, but also a vital resource for humanity's survival. Freshwater supplies, which had once seemed abundant, quickly became a precious commodity, and what little remained was rapidly being depleted. The fight for water began almost immediately, as cities and nations scrambled to secure what little remained of their freshwater resources. Rivers and lakes, which had once been teeming with life and vital to agriculture, now appeared as empty, dry basins. With the oceans gone, the natural water cycle that sustained rainfall in the planet's atmosphere had been shattered. Without rain, crops withered, and the very act of growing food became an impossible task. Across the globe, governments declared martial law, with authorities desperately trying to control access to water. Water rationing was implemented, and those without access to the most essential resource found themselves fighting, not just for survival, but for basic dignity. People became more and more desperate as the days passed. Wells that once had been reliable sources of fresh water now ran dry, and the air, once saturated with humidity and the promise of rain, felt parched and suffocating. The very ground beneath humanity's feet seemed to be cracking, as if the planet itself had turned against them. Communities began to fracture, and those who were once neighbours now became rivals in the struggle for survival. Refugees flooded into cities, drawn by the hope of securing water and food. The already overpopulated urban centres struggled to accommodate the influx, leading to overcrowded conditions, violence and chaos. In rural areas, people turned to desperate measures, drilling deeper into the earth in search of groundwater. But even that resource proved to be insufficient. The survival of humanity now rested on an increasingly fragile foundation, and it was clear that something, anything, needed to be done before the planet descended into an irreversible state of collapse. Scientists and engineers turned their focus to desperate solutions. Desalination plants, once a technology viewed as inefficient and expensive, were suddenly the world's last hope. These plants, capable of turning seawater into fresh water, were the only technology that could begin to replace the ocean's critical role. But the logistics were staggering. The world's desalination capacity was minuscule compared to the demand for fresh water. To meet even a fraction of the need, thousands of new plants would have to be constructed. But even as the technological experts worked tirelessly to solve this crisis, some began to question whether they were too late. Were they simply trying to plug a hole in the dam, or was humanity facing a more profound, irreversible fate? The race for water became a race against time. The dire consequences of the ocean's disappearance were unfolding, and it seemed as though every hour was more precious than the last. With the fight for water escalating, new alliances were formed, but old rivalries flared. Countries that had once been allies now fought over shared resources, and water became a currency, a tool of power and control. The true depth of the crisis was only beginning to reveal itself. As the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, humanity was left to ponder. Was this the end of civilization as they had known it? Or was there still hope for the future? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. The fight for water had become the defining battle of a new world, one that no one was truly prepared for. Without the oceans to regulate the Earth's climate, nature spiraled into chaos. What had once been a predictable rhythm of seasons and weather patterns now gave way to an unpredictable and extreme climate. Days sweltered under an oppressive heat, while nights grew bitterly cold. The absence of the oceans meant that the Earth's natural heat exchange mechanisms were disrupted, causing temperature fluctuations that left the planet reeling. The sun, once tempered by the ocean's cooling influence, now beat down with unrelenting fury, turning fertile lands into barren deserts. Crops that had thrived in once temperate climates now shriveled under the scorching heat. Harvests failed one after another, and global food shortages became a harsh reality. Entire regions, once considered agricultural powerhouses, found themselves unable to produce enough food to feed their populations. Without the oceans to moderate the temperature, droughts began to dominate vast swathes of land, turning once lush forests into fire-ravaged wastelands. The air, once moist and teeming with life, became dry, arid, and choking. Without the ocean's natural cooling effect, the planet's atmosphere grew thicker, heavier, and less breathable. The carbon cycle, once balanced by the ocean's vast carbon sinks, was now thrown into disarray. The rapid rise in temperature pushed the Earth into a state of environmental collapse, with the balance of ecosystems teetering on the brink of extinction. As the heat became unbearable, massive wildfires ignited across continents. Once thriving cities found themselves vulnerable to scorching heat waves that had never been witnessed before. What was once considered a seasonal event was now an ongoing crisis, with wildfires raging unchecked, their smoke filling the air, suffocating populations and further damaging the environment. In some areas, the sky turned an eerie orange as the flames consumed forests, and ash fell like snow, coating everything in a grim reminder of how fragile the planet had become. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, intense storms formed without warning, tearing through cities, flattening entire communities with unprecedented ferocity. These violent storms, driven by the imbalance in the atmosphere, wreaked havoc on coastal and inland regions alike. Rivers that had once been the lifeblood of civilizations became swollen with the torrential rains, flooding entire cities and displacing millions. The world's infrastructure, already strained by the ocean's disappearance, could no longer keep up with the pace of environmental destruction. With no oceans to regulate weather patterns, extreme temperatures became the new norm, creating pockets of unlivable climates and leaving humanity to fend for survival in an unforgiving world. As Earth's ecosystem continued to break down, scientists discovered that the loss of the oceans had set off a cascade of environmental events, each one worse than the last. With the oceans gone, the planet had lost its equilibrium. The heat waves, fires, and storms were merely the beginning. The shift in climate was now irreversible. The cascading effects could be felt in every corner of the globe, from droughts in Africa to floods in Asia, from the melting of polar ice caps to the raging infernos in the American West. People began to look toward the sky, hoping for rain, but it never came. The consequences of a planet without oceans were now undeniable. Nature had spiraled out of control and humanity was left to pick up the pieces. No one knew if they could survive this new world, but the struggle to do so had only just begun. With the oceans gone, the collapse of ecosystems was swift and unforgiving. The interconnected web of life, which had once thrived in perfect harmony, began to unravel. Marine life, the cornerstone of the planet's biodiversity, vanished in an instant, and with it, entire food chains crumbled. Species of fish, mammals, and plankton, each integral to the oceanic ecosystem, were gone forever. The absence of these creatures triggered a chain reaction on land. Predators, once dependent on the ocean's bounty, found themselves starving. Bears, wolves, and seabirds struggled to adapt to a world devoid of their primary food source. Even terrestrial life, which had never relied directly on the oceans, began to feel the ripple effect. Without the cooling influence of the oceans, heat waves became unbearable, and landlocked species, already stressed by environmental shifts, perished in droves. The once lush forests, which had drawn their nutrients from the deep cycles of the ocean, began to wither. Rivers, which once carried vital nutrients from the ocean to inland areas, dried up, leaving ecosystems to suffocate without their life-giving flow. The loss of the oceans disrupted every corner of Earth's biosphere. The oceans had been the planet's primary carbon sink, absorbing vast quantities of carbon dioxide and keeping the climate stable. Without them, the atmosphere thickened with greenhouse gases and global temperatures soared. This heating effect intensified, bringing extreme weather conditions, sweltering heat waves, violent storms, and prolonged droughts. The delicate balance of the planet's ecosystems could not withstand such dramatic changes. With no oceans to support the water cycle, rainfall became erratic, and droughts ravaged regions that had once been rich in vegetation. In these barren landscapes, species that had once thrived on the diversity of plant life were now fighting for survival. In deserts that were once inhospitable, new plant species, often invasive and fast-growing, began to dominate, outcompeting the few native species that managed to hang on. Forests too struggled under the intensity of the heat and the lack of water. Ancient trees, which had once stood as symbols of strength, began to wither as the ground beneath them cracked and dried. The natural world, once thriving, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Humans too felt the effects. Those who had relied on farming to sustain themselves now faced barren fields, unable to cultivate crops in the increasingly hostile climate. Farmers, once the backbone of civilizations, watched in horror as their livelihoods slipped through their fingers. Cities that had once been surrounded by verdant fields now found themselves in arid wastelands, unable to grow their own food or find new sources of sustenance. Desperate measures were taken to combat the loss of biodiversity, but there was little hope. Artificial farms, hydroponic systems, and genetically modified crops became the last refuge, but they could not replace the rich, varied ecosystems that had once flourished. Humanity's relationship with nature had always been complex, but now, in the wake of the ocean's disappearance, it was clear just how fragile that relationship truly was. The loss of ecosystems was not just an environmental issue, it was a matter of survival. As the world's ecosystems crumbled, it became apparent that no species, human or otherwise, was safe from the consequences. What had once seemed an insurmountable disaster had only been the beginning, and humanity was now forced to confront the devastating reality of a world forever changed. As the world struggled to cope with the unprecedented loss of the oceans, an insatiable hunger for answers began to rise. People gripped by fear and confusion wanted to know why the oceans had vanished, and if there was any hope for their return. Governments, once fractured by the chaos, now began to coalesce in the search for a solution, but the answers remained elusive. Scientists, researchers, and even scholars turned to ancient texts, mythic prophecies, and long-forgotten knowledge in hopes of uncovering a clue to the cause of the ocean's disappearance. Theories swirled, each one more bizarre than the last. Some pointed to an extraterrestrial event, an advanced civilization, or an alien force responsible for the vanishing of the oceans. Others believed it was a man-made disaster, the culmination of reckless experimentation with the planet's delicate balance. The most unsettling theory, however, suggested a cosmic shift, a cataclysmic event far beyond human comprehension. Whatever the cause, it became evident that the ocean's disappearance was no random disaster. It was part of a larger, darker mystery that had been unfolding for centuries. The deeper humanity dug for answers, the more bizarre the findings became. Ancient civilizations, from the Egyptians to the Maya, had recorded strange phenomena in their texts, events that eerily mirrored the disappearance of the oceans. In Sumerian tablets, there were mentions of a time when the seas would be swallowed, and in the Bible, vague references to waters retreating from the land had been seen as symbolic of the end times. Was it possible that the ancients had known of such an event long before it occurred? Was the disappearance of the oceans simply the latest chapter in a far older cosmic cycle? As the world's greatest minds delved into these ancient prophecies and texts, a new understanding began to emerge. The oceans were not just a physical entity, they were a cosmic force woven into the very fabric of Earth's destiny. They had not vanished without reason. They had receded to make way for something else, something that was about to reshape the world. The more scientists learned, the more they realized that they were dealing with a force that humanity had never truly understood. The oceans, it seemed, were part of a much larger cyclical pattern that governed the Earth, and perhaps even the universe. Yet, no one could predict what was to come next. As the planet continued to struggle without its seas, whispers of a coming shift, a turning of the tide, began to circulate. Some believed the oceans would return in time, but not as they once were. Others feared that the ocean's disappearance was just the beginning of an irreversible cosmic transformation that could lead to the Earth's destruction. The search for answers grew desperate. Teams of scientists, archaeologists, and even mystics from around the world gathered, trying to piece together fragments of ancient knowledge, prophecies, and cutting-edge technology in the hopes of understanding what had truly happened. The deeper they went, the more terrifying the implications became. If the ocean's disappearance was part of a larger cosmic pattern, was humanity's existence nothing more than a temporary blip in the grand scheme of things? The discovery of ancient artifacts suggested that civilizations long before recorded history had experienced similar cataclysms. As the world's collective understanding grew, it became clear the disappearance of the oceans was not a random disaster. It was a sign, a warning, that something larger than human comprehension was at play. In this search for answers, humanity was not only trying to understand what had happened, it was seeking to understand its place in the cosmos and what the future might hold. What if the oceans were hiding a secret much larger than we can comprehend? Dive deeper into this mystery and discover how the fate of the oceans impacts the very survival of humanity. Don't miss out. Subscribe for more mind-bending revelations and explore the truth behind the world's greatest mysteries. As the quest for answers deepened, humanity's understanding of the ocean's disappearance began to shift towards something far more unsettling, cosmic forces beyond their comprehension. The search had moved beyond science, blending with ancient knowledge that connected the fate of the oceans to a pattern in the universe that spanned millennia. The most groundbreaking revelation came from a team of astrophysicists and archaeologists who uncovered an ancient manuscript hidden within a forgotten temple, containing strange symbols that referenced a cosmic event known only in cryptic lore, the cycle of celestial rebirth. This cycle, it seemed, had occurred throughout Earth's history, marking moments when the oceans would vanish, only to return later, reshaped and more powerful. The manuscript hinted that the ocean's disappearance was not merely a random disaster, but part of a grander cosmic scheme, one that involved the alignment of celestial bodies and a shift in the Earth's energetic frequency. Ancient cultures, from the Sumerians to the Maya, had left behind fragmented accounts of a time when the seas would recede, as part of a universal cycle that spanned beyond human understanding. The oceans were not just a source of life, they were the very vessel of Earth's cosmic purpose. This revelation sent shockwaves through the scientific community, forcing them to reconsider everything they knew about the planet's history. It wasn't just the Earth's ecosystems that were in peril, it was the very fabric of time and space itself. The disappearance of the oceans, it seemed, was tied to an astronomical event that occurred once every several millennia. As the celestial bodies aligned, Earth's energy field was manipulated, causing an imbalance in the planet's natural systems. The oceans, once the Earth's regulator, had been removed to create space for a greater force, one that could usher in the next phase of Earth's evolution. As scientists worked to comprehend the magnitude of this discovery, the implications were terrifying. If this cycle had occurred before, then Earth had seen its oceans disappear in the distant past, but with no memory of the event. Until now. Were humans witnessing the beginning of the end, or were they simply part of a cosmic progression? For centuries, humans had been ignorant of their planet's true role in the universe, unable to see their existence as anything more than a blink in the vast expanse of time. Yet now, it was becoming clear that the oceans were only one small piece of a much larger puzzle. The very nature of the Earth, and its position in the universe, was far more intricate and interconnected than anyone had realized. The search for the truth was no longer just a quest for survival, it had become a spiritual journey. What did humanity's role in this cosmic cycle truly mean? What would happen when the oceans returned, and how would life adapt to the changes that lay ahead? As the discovery of the cosmic link spread throughout the world, the line between science and myth blurred, and the mystery of the ocean's disappearance became something much more profound. This was no longer just an environmental disaster, it was the beginning of humanity's awakening to its place in the universe. What had once seemed like an end was beginning to reveal itself as a new beginning. But the true test of humanity's survival was yet to come. As humanity began to unravel the mystery of the ocean's disappearance, a chilling realization emerged. This event was not merely the result of a natural disaster or cosmic anomaly. The oceans were not gone by accident. There were forces at play far beyond human comprehension, deep within the Earth itself. This new understanding sent ripples through the scientific community as experts in geology, physics, and astronomy worked together to examine anomalies beneath the Earth's surface. Their findings suggested that a complex network of hidden forces tied to the very core of the planet had been activated. These forces, long dormant, were now coming to life, influencing everything from the planet's magnetic field to its gravitational pull. As the world's best minds worked tirelessly to decode the data, they discovered an intricate connection between Earth's geological activity and the disappearance of the oceans. Beneath the surface, the planet was undergoing a transformation. Shifts in the Earth's core were causing massive magnetic anomalies. These anomalies were not only disrupting the planet's natural processes, but were also influencing the ocean's disappearance. The magnetic fields that had once stabilized the planet's temperature and weather patterns were now fluctuating wildly, leading to chaotic shifts in Earth's climate. But the mysteries didn't end there. Ancient records hidden away in sacred texts and forgotten temples began to reveal that the Earth had been through similar cosmic upheavals in the distant past. These records spoke of the awakening of the Earth's heart, a term used to describe the activation of the planet's inner forces. It was said that when these forces were unleashed, the Earth would undergo a transformation and the oceans would recede, leaving the world vulnerable to new, unknown forces. The more scientists delved into these ancient records, the more they began to question their previous understanding of Earth's history. Could the ocean's disappearance have been a deliberate act, orchestrated by these deep, hidden forces? Or was the planet simply undergoing a natural cycle that had been recorded in myth and legend long before humanity had even begun to understand its own place on Earth? The evidence pointed to a pattern. Every few millennia, the Earth's internal forces were activated, and this event, the disappearance of the oceans, was simply the most recent manifestation of this cycle. It wasn't just the oceans that were in peril, Everything from the Earth's surface to its very core was being affected by these hidden forces. These deep internal shifts were also having a profound impact on the planet's ecosystems. As the planet's magnetic and gravitational fields fluctuated, entire landscapes were being reshaped. Rivers that once flowed freely began to dry up, while mountain ranges began to shift, creating new and dangerous fault lines. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions became more frequent, as though the planet was shaking itself free of the ancient forces that had long held it in place. The Earth's hidden forces, which had once been dormant, were now waking up, and humanity was struggling to understand just how deeply these forces would reshape the world. The search for answers had now moved beyond the oceans. It was clear that Earth itself was in the throes of a profound transformation. These forces, hidden beneath the surface for millennia, were awakening now, and humanity could no longer ignore their influence. As the planet trembled beneath their feet, people began to realize the truth. The oceans had not simply disappeared. They had been called away by forces within the Earth itself. And now humanity was left to face the consequences of this cosmic upheaval. As the Earth continued to suffer without the oceans, a glimmer of hope emerged in the most unlikely of places, the Sahara Desert. Deep beneath the parched sands, scientists discovered something extraordinary: vast, ancient, underground reservoirs of water that had remained untouched for millions of years. The discovery was nothing short of miraculous. These hidden aquifers, once thought to be mere geological anomalies, contained billions of gallons of fresh water, enough to sustain life for generations if properly accessed. The revelation ignited a wave of excitement and renewed hope across the globe. Could this underground source be humanity's salvation in the face of the ocean's disappearance? The immediate response was one of disbelief, quickly followed by a frenzied rush to drill deeper into the Earth's crust to extract this newfound resource. Governments, international organizations, and private corporations all scrambled to claim a share of the precious water hidden beneath the desert's barren surface. Scientists and engineers worked around the clock, constructing massive drilling operations and building pipelines to transport the water to cities and regions in desperate need. The Sahara, a vast expanse once thought inhospitable, was now being transformed into the Earth's new water source. But with this newfound resource came new challenges. The extraction of water from these underground reservoirs was not as simple as it seemed. The process was slow, costly, and fraught with risks. To tap into these aquifers, technology had to be developed to withstand the immense pressures deep within the Earth's crust. Moreover, the ecological consequences of such large-scale water extraction were not fully understood. Some feared that draining these ancient aquifers too quickly could cause the land to collapse, triggering massive sinkholes or earthquakes. Still, the urgency of the situation pushed forward any caution, and the race to harness the underground water source became a global priority. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the solution to the world's water crisis had been found. This new source of water could replace the ocean's role in sustaining life. But as the drilling intensified and the water began to flow, a disturbing trend emerged. The extraction process was causing unexpected changes in the surrounding environment. As vast quantities of water were pulled from the ground, the landscape began to shift. The desert, once a symbol of life's struggle, started to change in subtle ways. New temporary lakes appeared where water had pooled, and certain plant species began to thrive in areas that were once too dry to support any life at all. However, other regions of the Sahara, once stable, began to experience violent, unpredictable shifts. Massive dust storms rolled across the landscape, and the ground trembled with tremors from deep beneath the surface. The delicate balance of the desert ecosystem had been altered, and some experts feared that the disruption of the water source could lead to catastrophic consequences. Despite these warning signs, the demand for water continued to rise. Cities that had once been on the brink of collapse now saw their populations surge as access to fresh water became more readily available. But the question remained: was this water source truly sustainable, or was it a temporary fix for a much larger, more complex problem? As scientists worked to monitor the long-term effects of the water extraction, humanity was left to wonder how much longer this new water source would last, and if it was the answer to their prayers or merely a fleeting illusion of salvation. The fragile veneer of civilization that had held the world together since the oceans vanished began to shatter under the weight of desperation. As the water from the newly discovered underground aquifers was pumped from the Sahara Desert, the desperate hope of salvation turned into a struggle for dominance. Governments, overwhelmed by the dire circumstances, adopted martial law to manage the chaos. Cities, once beacons of order and progress, became battlegrounds for control of the precious water supply. With each passing day, tensions mounted as resource wars broke out, not only between countries but also within them. Urban centres that had once been hubs of prosperity now stood at the brink of collapse. The lack of basic necessities, food, water and shelter, became the new currency, and the social order that had taken centuries to build began to disintegrate. Families, once close-knit, found themselves at odds over access to the increasingly scarce resources. Violence erupted as people fought for their survival, and the streets became battlegrounds for those desperate enough to take what they needed to survive. Meanwhile, outside the cities, entire rural communities were ravaged by waves of refugees fleeing the urban chaos. The land, once cultivated with care, was now being stripped bare. As crops withered and the soil dried up under relentless heat, the farmers found themselves unable to feed their families. Instead of nurturing the land, they fought to protect it from those who came to take what little remained. With the ecosystems collapsing and natural resources in rapid decline, humanity's sense of stability was upended. Governments tried to stabilize the situation by instituting rationing systems, but the chaos was too widespread. Economic systems, once tightly woven, unraveled as trade routes collapsed. Without the oceans to provide transportation and communication across borders, nations found themselves isolated, unable to support their citizens or each other. Yet, in the midst of this mounting chaos, there were those who believed that the planet's turmoil was not simply a result of environmental disaster, but rather an unfolding cycle, a cosmic event whose time had come. They spoke of the Earth's awakening, a natural process that had occurred long before recorded history. To some, the ocean's disappearance was not just a sign of disaster, but part of a grand, inevitable transformation. As humanity descended further into chaos, these voices became louder, warning that the path to salvation lay not in fighting for control of dwindling resources, but in understanding the larger forces at play. But these voices, drowned out by the roar of conflict, went unheard by most. Instead, the world focused on survival, each individual, each family, each government racing to ensure their own place in the world that had slipped into disarray. The once reliable systems that defined the structure of society had failed. Food and water became the primary concerns for everyone, and the desperation in the eyes of the people grew as they realized that their future hung in the balance. What was once a thriving world, full of interconnected nations, now resembled a fractured landscape, each piece struggling to survive on its own. The violent disintegration of order only fueled the growing fear that civilization as it had been known would never return. Governments collapsed, and in their place, warlords rose to power, ruling through force and fear. The descent into chaos had reached its peak, and the world was left to wonder if there was any hope for humanity's future. Could the Earth's hidden forces, once thought to be dormant, be guiding humanity toward its own renewal, or were they merely heralding the end of an era? As the world crumbled under the weight of its own chaos, a new battle began, one for the future of humanity itself. With governments collapsed and societies fractured, the race for survival became a battle of ideologies and power. In the absence of central authority, warlords rose from the ashes of broken nations, each claiming sovereignty over the remaining resources. Water, once a common good, had become the most coveted and fiercely protected asset on the planet. Nations that had once cooperated now fought violently for control over the underground aquifers of the Sahara and other newly discovered water sources. Desperate alliances were formed, only to be shattered by betrayal and bloodshed as the thirst for dominance reached new heights. In cities, groups of survivors banded together in small factions, each with its own vision of what the future should look like. Some believed that only through unity and collective effort could humanity rise from the ashes of the ocean's disappearance, while others, motivated by greed and fear, pursued ruthless paths to power. There were whispers of the rise of totalitarian regimes that promised order in exchange for absolute control, offering the illusion of safety at the expense of freedom. As the landscape grew more fragmented, the question of what humanity's future would look like became a matter of life or death. Meanwhile, the ecosystems continued to break down. Forests, once the lungs of the earth, began to die off as wildfires ravaged them with greater intensity than ever before. The lack of rain, the absence of the ocean's cooling influence, and the shifting weather patterns led to the collapse of food chains. Crops failed, and with it, the already fragile food supply was pushed to the brink of collapse. People began to resort to desperate measures to feed themselves, scavenging, hunting what few animals remained, and consuming anything they could get their hands on. It wasn't just the ecosystems that were unraveling, it was humanity's very way of life. As the ocean's disappearance brought down the pillars of civilization, the struggle to rebuild was shaped by those who controlled the last remaining resources. The battle for the future was not only a fight for survival, but a fight for power. Those who controlled the water, the food, and the energy held the keys to the future. The very foundation of society had been shaken to its core. While some sought to rebuild what had been lost, others believed that the future lay in adapting to the new world that had emerged in the aftermath of the ocean's disappearance. The struggle between those who wished to restore the old order and those who believed the future lay in accepting the changes was intensifying. A new kind of warfare had emerged, one not just for territory, but for the ideals of what humanity should become. Would humanity unite, striving to build something new from the ashes of the old world? Or would the forces of division and selfishness, now unleashed by the desperate scramble for resources, tear society apart forever? The battle for the future had begun, and its outcome would shape the destiny of humankind. As tensions mounted, the only certainty was that humanity was standing on the precipice of a new era, one that demanded unimaginable sacrifices. Could humanity overcome its basest instincts and find a way to rebuild? Or would it be doomed to descend further into chaos, never to recover from the devastating loss of the oceans? As the planet's ecosystems continued to collapse under the weight of the ocean's disappearance, humanity found itself pushed to the brink of survival. With no reliable source of water, food, or shelter, the Great Migration began. People left their homes, driven by the unrelenting need to find new territories where resources might still be available. Entire populations moved, hoping to escape the extreme weather, barren lands, and decaying infrastructure that had become the norm in once thriving cities. The urban centres that had once been hubs of civilization, full of energy and life, now lay in ruin, abandoned by those who had no choice but to flee. The roads were filled with people, families dragging their possessions, children clinging to their parents' sides, and the elderly struggling to keep up. Every movement was marked by desperation. As the mass migration unfolded, it became clear that no region of the earth was untouched by the devastation caused by the loss of the oceans. The seas had provided more than just water. They had maintained the planet's delicate balance. With the oceans gone, the weather patterns had become erratic. Some areas now baked in scorching heat, while others were ravaged by violent storms, floods, or freezing cold. Refugees moved in all directions, drawn by rumours of places that still had access to clean water, fertile soil, or functioning infrastructure. But the truth was, these pockets of hope were becoming scarce, and what little remained was rapidly being claimed by those in power. As people flocked to new territories, tensions grew. Governments, in a desperate attempt to maintain control, began erecting barriers to keep out the growing tide of migrants. The boundaries that had once defined nations were now reinforced by walls, armed checkpoints, and surveillance systems. What had once been a world of interconnected nations and shared resources was now fragmented into isolated territories, each fighting to protect its last remaining resources. The Great Migration was not just a movement of people, it was the breaking point of a global system. The fabric of society had begun to unravel. As resources became increasingly scarce, communities turned against one another. In some areas, groups of survivors formed tightly knit factions, fiercely guarding what little they had left. These factions began to fight over water, food, and land, and the once shared dream of rebuilding society fell apart under the weight of competition and fear. The larger migration was no longer just about survival, it had become a struggle for control. Yet, amid the destruction, there were those who still held on to the hope of rebuilding a new world. Some of the migrants held on to the idea of unity, believing that if they could find a place to settle together, they could begin to rebuild, to start over in a way that would ensure the survival of their children. But these voices grew quieter as the migration dragged on. The dream of cooperation was slowly being overshadowed by the harsh realities of survival. The Great Migration was becoming less of a journey toward hope and more of a scramble for the few remaining pockets of resources. As humanity pushed forward into unknown territories, the only certainty was that the future would look very different from the world they had known before the oceans disappeared. The planet, once lush and abundant, was now a hostile wasteland, marked by scarcity, division, and the desperation of its people. What had once been the heart of human civilization was now scattered across the land, each group fighting to protect what little they had left. But deep in the hearts of those moving, there still lingered a fragile hope that one day they could find a place to start anew, a place to rebuild the world they had lost. For years, the oceans had been nothing but a distant memory, a vanishing act that left the world gasping for breath. Yet, as humanity struggled to rebuild, strange events began to unfold. It started subtly. Unexpected shifts in weather patterns, rising humidity in areas that had once been dry, and whispers of mysterious waves rising where there had been only barren land. The oceans, thought to be forever gone, began to return. At first it was just a trickle, small patches of water appearing where vast deserts had once stretched. Scientists, still reeling from the loss of the seas, were stunned. The water, however, was not the same as before. It was dark, swirling, and unpredictable, more forceful than anything humanity had ever witnessed. Where once gentle tides had caressed the shores, now violent, tempestuous waves crashed against new coastlines, reshaping the very geography of the planet. It was as if the ocean had returned with a vengeance, its absence a necessary pause before the planet could be reshaped again. This new sea was different. It wasn't merely a return to the old order, but a harbinger of something new. Researchers and survivors alike ventured toward the emerging coastline, hoping to uncover the truth behind the sudden rise of the sea. What was its source? Why had it taken so long to return? What had caused it to rise with such violent force? As humanity struggled to understand these questions, it became apparent that the oceans were not just returning, they were bringing with them an unknown ecosystem. Creatures once thought extinct or relegated to the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean now began to emerge. Towering, shadowy figures roamed the newly flooded lands, and strange sea life, unlike anything ever recorded by human science, appeared along the coasts. The oceans had not just returned, they had been transformed, as though the land and the sea had fused in some cosmic dance. This was no mere return of water. It was the birth of a new world. With it came a sense of awe and dread. As the seas rose, so too did the anxiety among the survivors. The seas, though familiar, were now alien, something to be feared and revered in equal measure. Entire cities, once safe from the tides, found themselves inundated, their buildings swallowed whole by the rising waters. The survivors, having lost everything once, now faced the prospect of losing everything again. But this time, the seas were not just reclaiming their old territories, they were creating new ones, reshaping the very fabric of the earth. The return of the sea was no longer a question of whether it could be stopped. It was a question of how humanity would survive in a world that was no longer their own. As the tide swept across the land, some saw the rising waters as a symbol of rebirth, a chance to start anew. Others feared that the ocean's return signalled an irreversible change in the Earth's destiny, one that would sweep away any remnants of the old world. With each wave that crashed ashore, the future of humanity grew more uncertain. What did the sea want from humanity? Was it the Earth's final cleansing, or was it a test, a challenge to see if the human race could adapt to the new world rising from the depths? The questions seemed endless, and yet the answers remained elusive. As the seas continued their violent return, humanity was left scrambling to understand the forces at play. The once dominant oceans had vanished, only to return with new, inexplicable power. The questions multiplied with every rising tide. What caused the oceans to disappear in the first place? Why had they returned in such a transformed state? And most chilling of all, what did it mean for the future of Earth? As survivors banded together, there was a growing sense of urgency to uncover the truth behind the sea's re-emergence. Scientists, once thought to be the world's best hope for understanding the phenomenon, were baffled. No conventional explanation seemed to fit. In their search for answers, they turned, not only to modern scientific methods, but also to ancient texts and forgotten knowledge. Prophecies found in the ruins of civilizations long gone began to surface, offering cryptic clues. These ancient records spoke of a time when the Earth would be reshaped, a time when the seas would return not as they once were, but as a force capable of transforming the very fabric of life on the planet. As they scoured old libraries and studied the inscriptions carved into ancient stone, researchers began to connect dots between Earth's mysterious past and the present. There were consistent references to celestial alignments and cosmic events that coincided with the disappearance and subsequent return of the seas. One particular document, a tablet found in an ancient Sumerian ruin, hinted at a cyclical event known as the rebirth of the waters, a process that the Sumerians believed was tied to cosmic cycles beyond human understanding. The prophecy spoke of the oceans vanishing when Earth's energy shifted, and it foretold that they would return, not to restore the old order, but to bring forth a new world, one that would challenge everything humanity knew about life. The tablet suggested that the oceans were not simply water, but rather a living force, part of a greater cosmic plan. It was as if the Earth itself was alive, its waters not just a part of the planet's ecosystem, but the very essence of its evolutionary process. The return of the oceans, it seemed, was part of a much grander cycle of birth, destruction, and rebirth. The oceans were both a source of life and a harbinger of profound change. This revelation sent shockwaves through the scientific community. The oceans had not returned by chance. They were a response to something deep within the Earth, a force that had been dormant for eons. The researchers began to hypothesize that the oceans were the Earth's way of resetting itself, a cosmic cleansing that occurred when the planet reached a critical point in its natural cycle. The implications were staggering. Humanity had been living in the aftermath of this ancient force for centuries, completely unaware of the larger cyclical processes that governed the Earth's existence. The ocean's disappearance and return were not isolated events. They were part of a much greater universal pattern that stretched beyond Earth's borders. Now, as the seas surged across the planet's surface once more, humanity had to confront the terrifying reality. They were not masters of the Earth, but rather participants in an ongoing cosmic event that they could neither control nor fully understand. As the truth began to surface, the question remained, what would happen next? Would the Earth complete its cycle of rebirth, or was humanity on the verge of being swept away by a force too powerful to resist? The Earth, reshaped by the relentless return of the seas, now stood on the precipice of a new era. But humanity was not prepared for what was to come. The oceans, swelling with an energy that seemed to challenge the very essence of existence, continued to rise. Once thriving cities, which had managed to survive the initial upheavals, now found themselves vulnerable to the relentless surge of water, Coastal regions, once the heart of civilization, were now drowning beneath the weight of an unstoppable tide. The land that had once been fertile and thriving became a constant battlefield against nature's fury. As the seas rose higher, humanity's struggle for survival grew more desperate. Governments that had previously squabbled over resources now banded together, recognizing the truth that their future depended on unity. But the question remained, could humanity survive against such overwhelming odds? The world had already witnessed the ocean's return, but this was no mere rebirth. It was a complete transformation of the planet's ecosystems. The once stable ecosystems were now being rewritten by the very force that had once nurtured them. The world's survivors were faced with a harsh choice: adapt to the new reality or perish in the overwhelming tide. Cities, once the centers of civilization, had become islands surrounded by an ever-encroaching sea. But the fight for survival wasn't just about securing land, it was about securing resources. The ocean's return had flooded the world with new potential for growth, but it also brought with it new dangers. The emerging marine ecosystem was unlike anything humanity had ever known. New species, strange and often terrifying, swam through the waters, challenging human attempts to reclaim the land. The seas, once a symbol of life and trade, had now become a source of terror and the final test of humanity's endurance. The struggle to survive reached its peak as people began to fight not only against the rising tide but also against each other. Warlords who had emerged during the previous chaos now fought for control of the last habitable land, and those who still controlled access to water wielded unimaginable power. The desperation in the eyes of those clinging to whatever remained of the old world was palpable, as humanity's last stand unfolded before the ever-encroaching oceans. The battle for the future was no longer one of a hope, it had become one of sheer survival. As the waters continued to rise, civilization was fractured into warring factions. Some believed that humanity must adapt to the new world, learning to coexist with the seas, while others sought to fight back, refusing to accept the idea that humanity had lost its dominion over the planet. In the heart of this conflict, the true cost of humanity's choices became clear. No one would emerge unscathed. The return of the oceans was not merely a catastrophe. It was a reminder of the Earth's ultimate power over its inhabitants. Humanity had long believed itself to be the master of the planet, but now, in the face of nature's wrath, that illusion had been shattered. The time for hope was running out, and the question on every mind was whether humanity would find a way to adapt before it was too late. The world stood at the edge, caught between the collapse of everything known and the uncertain promise of a new future. The oceans had returned, but so had humanity's deepest fears, and the future of the planet now seemed more uncertain than ever before. As the oceans continued to surge across the planet, reshaping coastlines and drowning what was once familiar, a revelation began to emerge from the chaos, one that threatened to upend everything humanity thought they understood about their place in the world. A team of historians, geologists, and archaeologists working tirelessly in secret uncovered a truth hidden beneath the ruins of ancient civilizations, an unsettling truth that could explain the ocean's disappearance and return. Deep within the layers of forgotten temples and long-buried libraries, they discovered texts and artifacts that spoke of a time before recorded history, a time when the Earth itself seemed to operate under a cosmic law unknown to humankind. These texts, written in languages long thought to be dead, told of a cyclical pattern, a series of events that had been repeated across millennia. The oceans, it seemed, were not simply natural bodies of water, but a cosmic force that tied the planet to a larger universal system. The ancient civilizations, though they had no scientific understanding of the world, had sensed this connection and, in their own way, had documented the return of the oceans as part of a greater cosmic event, a process of destruction and rebirth that was essential to the Earth's evolution. The more the team delved into these discoveries, the more they realized that the oceans were not a random occurrence. They were tied to the energy of the Earth itself, activated during a time when the planet's core and magnetic fields shifted. This ancient knowledge revealed that the ocean's disappearance was part of a process to reset the Earth, to allow it to evolve in a way that would prepare the planet for a new stage in its development. The seas had retreated before in Earth's long history, but each time they returned, more powerful and dangerous than before. It became apparent that this wasn't just an environmental event, it was a signal, a cosmic marker in the natural history of the planet. Humanity had unknowingly reached the peak of the Earth cycle, and now the ocean's return was part of that grand design. However, there was a darker implication. If this cycle continued as it had in the past, then the oceans would not only return, they would reshape everything in their path. The return of the seas, as ancient records revealed, was not simply a harbinger of change, it was the precursor to the transformation of the planet itself. The ocean's return marked the beginning of a new chapter, but not one that humanity would survive in its current form. The survivors began to understand that their battle for survival was not just against the physical challenges of a planet in turmoil, but against the forces that governed the very fabric of their existence. The oceans were not merely reclaiming what they had lost, they were setting the stage for something far more profound. As the waters continued to rise, it became clear that the planet was undergoing a process that was as inevitable as it was terrifying. The questions that had plagued humanity for generations, why the oceans had disappeared, what they meant and what would happen when they returned, began to have answers. But these answers brought with them an even more chilling question. Could humanity adapt to the new reality? Or would they become casualties of an ancient cosmic cycle beyond their understanding? As the oceans roared back to life with a newfound fury, the Earth seemed to brace itself for a transformation that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. What had once been a dry, barren wasteland was now teeming with water, but it was not the gentle return of the seas that many had hoped for. It was a force of nature unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. The tides surged with intensity, flooding vast swathes of land, reshaping coastlines, and creating new, treacherous landscapes. Yet, within this chaos, there was a strange, undeniable sense of rebirth. Life began to re-emerge in ways that seemed almost impossible. Where once there had been only the harshness of desert sand, new life began to flourish. The waters, though dangerous, were also nurturing. Where floodwaters rose, new ecosystems took hold, with plants and animals adapted to the newfound conditions. Creatures, both familiar and foreign, appeared in the waters, bringing with them a wave of biodiversity that had been absent for far too long. It was as though the Earth itself had gone through a deep transformative cycle, and now nature was not merely surviving, it was thriving, reinventing itself in response to the powerful forces that had shaped the planet's past and now controlled its future. The survivors, though still struggling to rebuild their societies, found themselves caught in the middle of this renewal. The oceans, once feared and reviled, were now a paradox, a symbol of destruction, yes, but also of the possibility of new life. Yet as this new world was born from the chaos, the scars of the past remained visible. Cities, once bustling with life, now lay submerged beneath the sea's waves, their towering structures nothing more than monuments to humanity's hubris. There were those who tried to rebuild, clinging to the remnants of the old world, but they were few, and their efforts were increasingly futile as the planet itself seemed to reject the past. The old world was being swept away by the oceans, and in its place, a new world was rising. A world where humanity had to learn to live in harmony with the forces of nature or face extinction. The survivors who dared to venture into the heart of this reborn world found that it was not just the environment that was changing. They too were being transformed. The trials they faced, the loss of the oceans, the battle for survival, the rebuilding of civilization, had altered the very essence of human society. Gone were the divisions that had once separated nations and cultures. Now, in the face of overwhelming odds, the survivors were forced to work together or perish alone. The shift was not just physical, it was psychological. People had been forced to confront their own mortality, and with that many had shed the old ways of thinking. a new sense of unity began to emerge, fueled by the shared struggle against the forces of nature. They understood now that the ocean's return was not just a natural event, it was a call to humanity to evolve, to adapt to the Earth's new reality. But this rebirth came at a price. As the new ecosystems flourished, humanity's presence on the Earth was constantly tested. The balance between survival and destruction teetered on a knife's edge. The oceans, in all their power, were not benevolent. They were part of a larger cosmic cycle that demanded respect. The new world would not be easy to navigate, but for those willing to change, to embrace the new world with humility and reverence, there was hope. The Earth had been reborn, but now humanity faced the challenge of learning to coexist with the forces that had always shaped their destiny. It was a fragile hope, and one that was far from certain, but in the rising waters there was a glimmer of possibility. As the planet continued to shift under the weight of the returning oceans, the surviving humans, struggling to adapt to their transformed world, stumbled upon a revelation that would change everything. The ancient knowledge, pieced together from forgotten texts and the studies of the world's greatest minds, had led them to an undeniable truth. The Earth was not merely experiencing a natural upheaval, but was part of a much larger cosmic pattern, one that governed not only the planet but the very fabric of the universe itself. Scientists, in their search for answers, discovered that the return of the oceans was not a mere occurrence. It was a preordained event, a vital step in the cycle of life and destruction that had played out across the cosmos for eons. The cosmic revelation came from a cryptic artifact found in the depths of what was once a thriving port city, now submerged beneath the tides. This artifact, unlike anything humanity had encountered before, emitted a strange rhythmic energy. It pulsed in tune with the Earth's movements, syncing with the rising and falling of the tides. When the artifact was analysed, it revealed a startling connection between the Earth's magnetic field, its oceans, and the very fabric of time itself. This revelation stunned the scientific community. The oceans were not simply reservoirs of water. They were channels of cosmic energy, flowing through the Earth in waves, regulating the planet's connection to the universe. The loss of the oceans had disrupted this flow, causing an imbalance that had triggered the catastrophic events that followed. The return of the oceans, therefore, was not just the regrowth of water. It was the Earth restoring its cosmic balance. It was the planet's way of realigning itself with the greater universe, a process that had been set in motion long before humanity ever existed. The revelation that Earth was part of a larger cosmic order came with profound implications. It meant that the ocean's disappearance and return were not random events. They were part of an inevitable cycle, a process that had been repeated countless times in the history of the universe. This knowledge, while eye-opening, also raised an uncomfortable question. If Earth was merely a pawn in this vast cosmic game, what role did humanity truly play in the grand scheme of things? Were they simply witnesses to an ongoing process, or did they have the power to influence the cycle in some way? As the survivors struggled to understand this cosmic revelation, they realized that their struggle for survival was not just a fight for resources or territory. It was a fight for understanding, a desperate race to comprehend their place in the universe and whether they could shape the outcome of this grand cycle. The oceans were not merely returning, they were offering humanity a choice. Would they learn to live in harmony with the forces that shape their world, or would they be swept away by a force far beyond their control? The cosmic revelation left humanity with more questions than answers, and as the seas rose and the Earth continued to shift, one thing became clear. The battle for the future was not just about survival. It was about discovering what role humanity would play in the next chapter of the universe's eternal cycle. The world, forever altered by the return of the oceans, stood on the cusp of a new era. The seas, now more powerful and unpredictable than ever, had reshaped the planet, but in their wake, a glimmer of hope began to emerge. humanity, battered by the years of loss, conflict, and survival, had come to a crossroads. The Great Migration, the battle for resources, and the cosmic revelation had all culminated in this defining moment. As the oceans rose and receded, the Earth itself seemed to be offering a fresh start, a new dawn for those willing to embrace the challenges of a transformed world. The survivors, those who had endured the collapse of societies, the destruction of ecosystems, and the chaos of the past years, now found themselves with a singular task: to rebuild. But this rebuilding was not simply about restoring what had been lost. It was about adapting to the new reality that the ocean's return had created. The survivors understood that the old ways could not return. The oceans, now an undeniable force of nature, were no longer something to fear or control. They were a reminder that humanity was part of a much larger system, a cycle that had been in motion long before their existence and would continue long after. The survivors' task was not to conquer this new world, but to learn to coexist with it, to respect the forces that governed it. As the oceans surged with life, bringing new ecosystems into being, humanity had the chance to embrace a new way of living. Cities once designed to shield humanity from the forces of nature began to evolve into sustainable hubs, integrated with the land and sea in ways that were once unthinkable. Water, once a scarce and precious commodity, was now abundant again. But the survivors learned to use it wisely, understanding its power and its delicate balance. Renewable energy sources, powered by the movements of the oceans, wind, and sun, became the backbone of these new societies. The survivors embraced technology and nature in harmony, creating systems that allowed them to thrive in the face of an uncertain future. Yet, as the new dawn broke over this transformed world, there were those who still struggled to accept the change. Some refused to believe that the old world was truly gone, clinging to the past with a desperate hope that things would return to the way they were. Others, motivated by fear and power, sought to control the new world, trying to impose their will on the natural forces that now shaped their lives. These factions, while a minority, threatened the fragile peace that had begun to take root. But the majority, those who had learned to adapt and respect the Earth's new rhythms, stood firm. The oceans had returned, and with them came the chance for a fresh start. It would not be easy, but the survivors knew that the new dawn offered more than just survival. It offered the possibility of a renewed relationship with the planet, one based on understanding, cooperation, and respect. The Earth, in all its power and mystery, had given humanity a second chance, and now it was up to them to make the most of it. The new world was theirs to shape, and as the sun rose over the horizon, casting its light on a planet both reborn and transformed, humanity stood ready to embrace the challenges and opportunities of a future they had once feared to even imagine. As the world stood at the threshold of a new era, the survivors, those who had endured the return of the oceans, the chaos of society's collapse, and the rebirth of ecosystems, could finally see the shape of a new civilization taking form. The Earth had been remade, but questions lingered, questions that had never been fully answered. The ocean had returned, and with it, a force unlike anything humanity had ever understood. What were the true reasons for its disappearance? What cosmic event had caused such a profound disturbance? And perhaps most chilling of all, why had the oceans come back so changed? And what did this mean for the future of humankind? The truth remained elusive, shrouded in mystery, but some began to believe that the answers lay deeper than humanity's collective knowledge could fathom. Amid the tentative rebuilding, whispers of a hidden truth began to circulate among those who had studied the ancient texts, the lost prophecies, and the strange artifacts left behind by civilizations long gone. Some of these fragments, unearthed from beneath the newly risen tides, hinted at an even greater cosmic mystery, one that transcended the Earth itself. A recurring motif in these records was the idea of a cosmic balance, suggesting that the oceans were not just a product of planetary ecosystems, they were a bridge to something far more expansive, a connection between Earth and other celestial bodies. It was as if the oceans had been part of a larger galactic cycle, and their return signalled the end of one phase of existence and the beginning of another, not just for the Earth, but for the cosmos itself. As humanity grappled with these ideas, the ocean's return grew more unpredictable. Where new islands had risen, strange phenomena were becoming more common. Unexplained energy shifts, unusual electromagnetic disturbances, and the appearance of new, otherworldly creatures in the depths of the sea. The survivors found themselves caught in the middle of this awakening, trying to decode a mystery that seemed to have no end. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. Humanity had to face the unsettling reality that they were not just witnessing the birth of a new world. They were part of a much larger cosmic event. What humanity had believed to be random disasters, fires, earthquakes, floods, had all been part of the Earth's recalibration, a necessary process that had been occurring for millions of years. The final mystery was that humanity, despite its achievements, had never truly understood its place in the universe. The ocean's disappearance and return had not been a mere accident or a momentary calamity. They were the product of an ancient design, an order beyond human comprehension, one that humanity had unwittingly disrupted. In their struggle for survival, humans had unwittingly become the catalyst for this cosmic shift, and now they had to face the consequences of that reality. Was this a final warning, or was it an invitation to evolve? The answer was as elusive as the ocean itself, vast, unfathomable, and far-reaching. The oceans were more than just a resource. They were the pulse of Earth's larger connection to the cosmos. Humanity had always seen itself as the pinnacle of life, but the ocean's return had shattered that illusion. The true power, it seemed, lay not in humanity's control over the planet, but in its ability to adapt to the forces beyond it. The final mystery was not just the oceans, it was the universe's deeper, eternal rhythm and humanity's role in it. As the seas continued their unpredictable rise, one thing became clear. The answers were always within reach, but they required humanity to look beyond its own limited perspective. The cosmic cycle was far from over, and the final chapter was yet to be written. As the Earth slowly recovers and the oceans return in a form more powerful than ever, humanity faces a choice. Will we embrace the knowledge hidden beneath the waves, or will we repeat the mistakes of the past? The mystery of the ocean's disappearance may have been solved, but the real question remains. What will we do with the knowledge we've gained? Join us next time as we continue exploring the world's greatest mysteries and uncover the secrets of our existence.